Okay, so topic is El Nino and tropical basin interactions, and I did this together with David and a few others that helped. Mostly the help was on the technical side, while this El Nino stuff is mostly my kind of contribution. So I'll give a bit of an overview of what I'll be talking about. So do you see my mouse as a pointer? Yeah, okay. So in terms of motivation, there's basically two sides of motivations. One is model development and the other one is El Nino dynamics. So my research topic is El Nino dynamics, but since this is a working group on modeling, I focus a little bit on the modeling side because I thought this is probably what most of you are interested in. Not all of you are ENSO experts, but obviously there's a science related to this. This is ENSO. So I'm talking about the ENSO dynamics. And this study is submitted to a journal and it's currently under review, and we haven't heard back yet, but hopefully it will not be too negative. So I will then talk about the ENSO experiments, and the study that I submitted is with the GFDA model, and you will see why this is a GFDA model and not the ACCESS model. But I will also show you the results that I did this quarter with burning 1 million CPU time hours with the ACCESS model ESM 1.5. Okay, so model development. So originally this model started out as a deep paleo study. And the idea was to rearrange land and oceans. So today's land and oceans have been shown here. Why is it disappearing? So today's distribution looks like this. And about 55 million years ago, India was not connected to Asia. There was a bunch of ocean that doesn't exist anymore. And Australia is way down south here. So it looks like the Pacific is a little bit bigger and there's a connection to the Atlantic. That is scientifically interesting for the monsoon changes, but also for changes in ENSO. And initially I thought this would be a piece of cake to do this in the ACCESS model, but it turned out to be not simple at all. So this is much harder than you think. So we tried this with a low resolution ACCESS model. I'll talk about this in a second. And we haven't been able to do this. So Abhik Santra, he started in 2022 working on this. He just got stuck, couldn't do it. And then last year, I tried to take it over and do it. I couldn't do it. I asked around in ACCESS-NRI to get help, but I didn't get much help. And David was working on the same problem with the ACCESS-ESM, and he also couldn't get it working initially. So we basically spent a few months on trying to get this done, and we can't do it. And so David worked on the ACCESS-ESM 1.5, and after about a year or so, he got it done. And this is what I'm working on now in this quarter. But David also did this some time ago with the GFDA model, and within 1 month, I could actually get it going. So I managed to do this. And maybe as a background, I've been working on carpet modeling since 1996. And one of my first things that I did as a PhD student when I started, which was maybe in the first few months when I started being a PhD, I moved Cuba to a different place to change the Gulf Stream, and it took me 2 weeks to do it. So I come from a background at Max Planck where you just go to the next door and that person shows you how to do it, and it's done. Right? And maybe back in 1996, the models were simpler, and the people who actually worked with the model actually did code the model. But now we are dealing with a model that nobody understands, nobody's really coding it, and nobody has the expertise to actually tell you how to do simple stuff like moving around the continent, which I find really frustrating, but that's the way things are. And I'm pretty sure that this is not an ACCESS problem. I'm pretty sure that this is a problem everywhere, but I find it really frustrating. Anyway, this is not my motivation. I'm not interested in paleo. I don't care about deep paleo, really. I only care about modeling on the present day. And I like to have a fast GCM. This is really my motivation. This is why I did get into this project, because I thought it helped me to develop this fast GCM where I can play around with. So about more than 10 years ago, I started to have a reduced resolution version of the ACCESS carpet model, which we call ACCESS-N48, which is a low resolution atmosphere model. And we've done some experiments with this and it looks pretty good. So the model biases and errors in this model are about similar than in the ACCESS CM2, I think, or CM, I'm not sure exactly which one it is, but it's a pre-version of the ACCESS CM2, I think. And this is a model that I wanted to develop to have a faster model, that runs something that runs about 100 years a day. Because typically for the kind of research that I'm involved with, which is climate dynamics on a longer timescale, so 10 years, or a few years to 100 years, I need many, many simulations of 100 years of runs, and it's unpractical with the current models. So I like to explore climate dynamics and I like to play around. And you will see an example of this today. And that is really my motivation. I'm not interested in paleo, I'm interested in current day climate. So typically what I would like to have is run a 100-year simulation within a day so that I can do an experiment and next day I can analyze it and see what happens. But CMIT type of models don't do this anymore. Okay, motivation for ENSO dynamics. So this was the modeling development motivation and now the motivation in terms of ENSO science. So I use here a figure from Pietro D'Annunzio. He was interested in the Indian Ocean dipole, but I like this figure because it shows the standard deviation of SST, and you can see there's this big thing in the Pacific, and there's a middle thing in the Atlantic, and there's basically nothing in the Indian Ocean. And the question you might ask that I think is interesting is why is there a big thing in the Pacific and not in the other oceans? And it's interesting because we don't fully understand how ENSO works. There's problems in the dynamics, like the nonlinearity or the seasonality, that nobody exactly knows how it works. And also the models simulate ENSOs different from the observed. And why are the models different in ENSO from the observed is also not quite clear. There's a number of ideas. Oops, where's it gone to? But it's not exactly clear. So I find this is an interesting question. Then the other thing that is a hot topic right now is that people think that ENSO in the Pacific not only influences the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic, but that the Atlantic, what happens here, influences ENSO. And this is a bit of a controversial topic. Not everybody agrees on this. Some people say that the Pacific really doesn't care about the other oceans. That is, whatever they say from observations, this is just a statistical artifact. It's not really true. So in principle, the Pacific is really doing its own stuff. It influences the rest of the world, and the rest of the world has no feedback onto the Pacific. So since there's some controversy about this, this is an interesting topic to explore. So just from the theory, you would in general think that a larger basin like the Pacific would have larger SST variability, which you can see here. The big Pacific has much more variability than the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean. And a larger basin would also have longer periods, simply because the idea is that what drives this is ocean waves, like the Rossby waves. They would be influenced by the winds, they propagate to the west, then get reflected, and then they enhance the variability on the equator. And this takes time, a few months, and the bigger the basin, the longer it would take. So the idea is the longer the basin and the zonal direction, the longer the time period of the ENSO or NINU should be. That is the theory, but hasn't really ever been tested. And also the theory doesn't say anything about anything outside of the Pacific. So the theory basically says the rest of the world is irrelevant. It's really just the Pacific that matters. And what else outside the Pacific plays no role. And you will see this theory is crap. It doesn't work. So the reality looks different. And this is what I will show you with my experiments. Okay, so I will talk about the GFDL experiments. So first of all, the GFDL 2.1 and this paleo configuration is a low resolution model. So the atmosphere is really, really low resolution. You might say this is ridiculously low, but this is what I have. And the ocean is in a decent resolution, but still low resolution. And this is how the topography and land and ocean distribution looks like. And then I do simplified experiments. So I change my global map to here. In this first case, you basically have no continents in the tropics at all. And then I increase the continent size so that the basin gets smaller and smaller. So basically, this is my single basin experiments where I start out basically with an Atlantic size, small basin, and then I get to the Pacific size. And eventually I get to the whole global no limit basin where there's no continents in the tropics. I will not talk about this experiment. The biggest one that I talk about is this one, where there is this continent in the tropics, but it's pretty small. And then I do experiments where I have two ocean basins. So here in the middle one is two identical Pacific size twins. And in the upper one, I have on the left a Pacific size basin, on the right also Pacific, but with a shallow ocean. I call this the Coral Sea. This one here I call twins. And then I have another one, which I call Hermanito. Hermanito means little brother. I have a big one, and I have a little brother, something like Pacific and Atlantic. But I will not show much about this one. And then I have experiments where I have 3 tropical ocean basins, starting with 3 identical ones, so the trio. And then I increase the central one to become bigger and bigger. So kind of the trio 160 is kind of the situation where you have a bigger Pacific, a small Indian Ocean, and a small Atlantic, simplified. Okay, a little bit more about the development. So I started this out, I didn't have a proposal or plan, right? So I started this out, and the plan was to simulate the Eocene. So 55 million years ago, where India was not connected to Asia. But since I couldn't get it going, I was playing around, moving things around, and by playing around, I noticed this is interesting for linear dynamics. So this is how I often work. I usually have no plan, I play around, and then I do something. So my first set of experiments, maybe about 50 experiments, they run for a time step or a few years, and they all crash because we didn't know what we are doing. And then David helped me to actually get it going. So initially they crashed with the ACCESS model, and I talked not about this, then they crashed with the GFDA model, and then I get the GFDA model going. And then I did a set of experiments. I noticed they are interesting, but they were not consistent in the way that they work out. Like I haven't changed the topography in a consistent way, or the ocean topography was flat and not realistic. So I eventually made a few runs that I do not use in my publication. And then I have a set of runs which I actually published. These are 15 runs that I actually published. They are 250 years long. So with the GFDL, that means all of these runs are about 1 million CPUs together, and one run takes about 5 days, which for me is a decent amount of time to actually work with this. So I come up with something, I run it, and then I look at the results in the next few days, and then I think about what else should I do. With the ACCESS-ESM 1.5, I would have about 5 times more CPU I would need, and each of these runs take significantly longer. So the project, when I started out in July working on this, and I ended all of the experiments in October, so about 4 months. I think with the ACCESS model, since it's super slow, and it would take about a year to realize this, I think. So for the way that I work on these kind of things, when I just exploring stuff, I play around and I don't really have a plan, I would not be able to do this with a CMAP type model. They are too slow and too expensive. So I don't like CMAP type models because they are just not the type of models that I work with. Just as a reference, in 2009, when I was still in Germany, I had a model that runs 100 years a day on a computer, and nobody asked me about CPU time. I could run as many simulations as I wanted to. And I wanted to have such a model here in Australia, but it doesn't exist here. Okay, so let's get to the science results. So I did these single basin ones. So the lower one here is the small one, is the Atlantic size, and then there's here the Pacific size and the bigger and bigger ones. And this is the SST standard deviation. And you can probably notice, and if you start from the Atlantic, it has little variability. The variability increases when you get to the Pacific size. But then, surprisingly, you're increasing the size and the variability doesn't get bigger. Actually, first of all, it gets smaller, and then it gets bigger again. So this is here in this summarized, in these black boxes here, I calculate the standard deviations. And here on the x-axis is the basin size. So small is like the Atlantic, and then here the Pacific, and then the bigger ones that don't have a counterpart in the real world. But you can see it peaks at the Pacific, and then it decreases, and then it increases again. This is fairly unexpected. So nothing in this ENSO theory would suggest that. One has to keep in mind that ENSO theory is mostly done by oceanographers. They don't think much about the atmosphere. They mostly think about the ocean. And from the ocean dynamics, this is really not what you would have expected, which kind of indicates it's probably something driven by the atmosphere. So why is this happening? I can't tell you right now, but I have a PhD student, Yi Wang, who is working on this. And I think we have some good idea for why this is happening. And it's all related to the atmospheric dynamics. The other element is the periodicity. So I look at the SST index in these boxes, and I calculate the power spectra. And then here is 1 year, here is 10 years. So the power spectrum should somewhere peak between 10 and 1 year. And you can see the biggest basin, this is the purple one here. Then the next biggest is the blue one, then the green one, and the green one. So I only show you the 4 big ones here. And you can see for the 4 big ones, the smallest one is the light green, then this one and this one. So the peak moves to higher frequency the bigger the basin gets, which is kind of the opposite what everybody would tell you about ENSO dynamics, that the bigger the basin gets, the frequency should shift to lower frequencies. But the exact opposite is happening here in these big basins. So I quantified this, the peak frequency. So on the y-axis here is the frequency of the peak in the power spectrum, which I try to estimate somehow. And higher up means high frequency and lower down means low frequency. And here on the x-axis is the basin width. So if you start out with the Atlantic, you have lots of high frequency and you go towards lower frequency. That's kind of what you expected. So, but then from bigger than 200 degrees widths, the frequency starts to increase again, which is kind of counterintuitive and not really expected. There's another way of estimating this with the so-called Wörtke index based on the research oscillator model dynamics, and it kind of measures the same thing. So kind of something unexpected happens, that if you get bigger than the Pacific, the frequencies increase. So this idea from theory, larger basin, longer periods is just incorrect. Doesn't work in this model. And again, I think it's due to the atmospheric dynamics. I don't have proof for this, but we are working on it currently. Now the more interesting experiments. So this is now, I have this first one here, just a single Pacific basin size. And then I have another one with where the other ocean basin is a shallow ocean basin. And then I have the one with two twins, two Pacifics. So in the first one, we had this SST variability in the Pacific. In the next one, where we have this shallow ocean on the other side, the variability gets decreased, it gets damped. And there's not much equatorial variability in the Coral Sea because a shallow ocean doesn't allow any type of variability. And if you have two twins, you have much more variability. So suddenly the ENSO variability is hugely increased. In other words, it very strongly matters whether you have another ocean basin to the left or to the right, and it completely changes its ENSO dynamics. So in the theory, the rest of the world doesn't matter, and it's pretty clear here that these other ocean basins do matter. Whether you have land outside the ocean or you have a shallow ocean or a dynamical deep ocean, it completely changes the ENSO variability. This again opens up the question of how is this working? And again, I cannot show you anything on that, but I'm working on it. And again, I think it's the atmospheric dynamics. So basically, the linking of the Walker circulations in the ocean basins that actually makes this large amount of variability. In terms of correlation, so I did an UF analysis on the left basin, and then I correlate the PC1 index with the surface temperature of the whole domain. And you can see if you have a single basin, then the land is positively correlated in the surface temperatures. If you have the single basin and the other one is a shallow, there's not much of a correlation. But if you have two twin Pacifics, then they are out of phase. So when the one has an El Niño, the other one has a La Niña. So they are perfectly swinging between these different states. Now there's three basins. So I start out with three identical basins, and then I increase the size of the central basins. And you can see, again, these three basins have much more variability than an individual basin would have. And if you increase the size of the central basin, actually the variability in the central basin decreases, but it doesn't decrease as fast as the basins that become smaller. So what happens if you have a dominant basin, you are still decreasing variability in all the basins, but the central, the big one, the variability decreases less than in the smaller ones, which looks a bit like that the central one would suppress the variability in the smaller ones. Again, about cross-correlation, the cross-correlations are kind of tricky. So in the three identical one, you have basically a wave of three out-of-phase events that are linking to each other. So when one has the El Niño, the other one has a developing or decaying La Niña. And this is identical for each of these basins. They're all identical to each other, but they have a three-time splitting of a cycle. And this becomes then changing into the one in the center becoming more dominant and more driving the other basins. Okay, in summary, the GFDI experiments have been really, really interesting, and I got really excited last year about these ones. The ENSO does not get stronger with basin size, which is really unexpected, I think. More interestingly, actually, the interaction between basins is really very interesting and much stronger than I think anyone would have guessed. And it really indicates that the ENSO theory, you can forget about it. It has to be changed again. And I think this is because the ENSO theory is really based on ocean dynamics only and hasn't considered what happens with the Walker circulation. So my hypothesis is we have to understand the tropical atmospheric dynamics, and that is actually the main control of ENSO. At least in these aspects that I'm discussing here, they are really important. Probably indicating that the ENSO theory has really lacked understanding in the atmosphere. While there's been good understanding of the ocean part, there isn't enough understanding of the atmosphere. So the larger basin then in this perspective that the atmospheric dynamics are controlling everything, the larger basins will lead to atmospheric rearrangement that are interfering and potentially blocking ENSO variability. This could be because if you get large, then the signal goes around the Earth, that the big basin would then interfere on the other ends, or it would become more stretched out, and therefore the meridional higher latitudes interactions are more relevant instead of the zonal ones, which in ENSO, it's all about the zonal winds. But now there's maybe other winds that are becoming more prevalent, like meridional winds. And also the dynamical ocean basins, they can actually provide heat fluxes, and heat fluxes to the atmosphere leads to vertical movement, and that can kick off the Walker circulations. So the heat fluxes that come from dynamical oceans can be synchronized in a way that leads to strong interactions between the ocean basins. That's my hypothesis. Haven't been proved yet, but we are working on it. Okay, that much about the GFDI experiments. So now the ACCESS-ESM 1.5, which David managed to get this going. So what we basically do is we use the setup from the GFDI model, and then David wrote a script to mimic these exactly into the ACCESS-ESM 1.5. With one exception, that in my experiments, I had the Arctic Ocean isolated and I had a circular northern hemispheric continent. But David created a connection at one point, which may lead to asymmetries, but I'm not sure about it. But you will see asymmetries now that you didn't saw before. Okay, so I didn't repeat all of the experiments because they are, as I said, they are expensive and they take a long time. So in the single basins, I repeated these 4 experiments with the ACCESS-ESM. And you can notice that they are also strongest in the Pacific size and they are weaker in the big basins, but they are also generally weaker. And the big basin here, the 350-degree basin, isn't nearly as strong as in the GFDI model. It is much weaker. But then again, the Atlantic is much weaker than the Pacific, and the bigger one, the 250 degrees, is also much weaker than Pacific. So in a sense, there's overall some agreement, but there's a disagreement on the overall strength of variability, and especially in the big one here, which has very little variability in the ACCESS-ESM 1.5. So in terms of peak frequency, I showed you that this peak frequency is, first of all, the periodicity is increasing. So the periodicity gets longer with increasing basin size, and then it decreases again. And this is kind of also happening in our ACCESS-ESM 1.5, but I have fewer data points and doesn't seem to be as strong. But the tendency is about the same, I think. Now the basin interactions. So in the single Pacific, similar to the single Pacific here, the one with the coral sea is also damped compared to the single Pacific, but there's much more variability in the coral sea than in the GFDI one. Not quite sure why that is, but that is the case. And the twins are similar. So again, you have highly energized twin behavior here, which has the same kind of similar kind of structure. And with the 3 basins, so the trio is again strongly amplified, again strongly interactive with each other in a very similar way that we saw in the GFDL. And the bigger basin also has the central basin has less variability, but more than the other ones, the smaller ones. So the smaller ones get damped more than the central one. So here's the 9 experiments that I did. So these are the solo ones here. Then this is the coral sea, the twins, the Hermanito. The Hermanito is the one where you have 1 big basin and 1 smaller one. And then the trio, and then the 360, where the central one is a little bit bigger. And red is this ACCESS model, and blue is a GFDI model. I think what you can in general see is that the ACCESS model has less variability than the GFDL one. I'm not sure why that is. I mean, the main difference is the atmospheric model. The ACCESS has a higher resolution and a totally different atmosphere code. But the difference is strongest in the big ocean, right? So the big ocean is 350, there's a huge difference in the variability. I mean, they both peak clearly, but the GFDL peaks on a higher frequency and has much more variability. But then on the other hand, in the Hermanito in the ACCESS model peaks very nicely, while the GFDL and Hermanito doesn't really peak that clearly. So there are some differences. And I think the major difference is that the ACCESS model has less variability. But then there's also detailed differences. But if I would summarize it in some of the main findings, so some main findings like it peaks at 150 degrees, it has a shorter period for bigger basins, the twins and the trios are much stronger and highly synchronized. And we have this horseshoe pattern showing up in when you have tropical basin interaction. All of this I see in the GFDA model, and basically all of this I see in the ACCESS model, although not all of this is that clear. So the shorter period for bigger basin is not as clear in the ACCESS model. The trio synchronization, and maybe I'll show this here again. You can see here that the left basin, which is identical in geometry to the other basins, but still has less variability. I'm not sure whether this is statistically significant, but it looks like it could actually be statistically significant. But I wouldn't be able to explain why, because the tropics 3 basins are identical to each other. It must be maybe the extratropical that influences, but it could also be just a fluctuation of low frequency variations that shows up here. And the horseshoe pattern, so this is this kind of what I mean by horseshoe pattern. Maybe I come back to this. This horseshoe pattern is this pattern here. Maybe I show a pattern here. You see this single Pacific has no negative anomalies here in the leading EOF. But the coupled modes has this horseshoe pattern that we know from observation, where negative correlation in the west and in the high latitudes and positive correlation in the east and on the equator. This kind of horseshoe pattern only shows up in tropical basin interaction. It doesn't show up in single basins. Yeah, so in summary, I would say we have fairly interesting results in the GFDA model that are basically confirmed by the ACCESS model, but I haven't done all the experiments. So if we need to burn another few million CPUs, I can do it by completing the experiments or come up with new ones. But I leave it for now because I think mostly I'm okay with it, but I might analyze the ones that I have. I'm done. Thank you for listening. And if you have questions, ask questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Dietmar. Yeah, really interesting stuff. Questions from the audience. I'm conscious that I was involved in the studies. I will try to get someone else to ask a question first. Yeah, Andrew.
Thanks, Dietmar. Super interesting work. I guess so. Yeah, there's a bunch of questions I got for this one. So it looks like there's a lot of resonance or coupling going on here, right? There's some sort of coupled resonance when you've got the 3 basins being identical or 2 basins being identical. Is it possible? Have you looked at this in terms of coupled oscillators and so on? I'm wondering. So
yes.
you showed it's very strong when they're identical, and then when they're sufficiently non-identical, it's very different. But is there a little window of closeness in which you still get the resonance effect happening, for example?
Yeah, I don't understand your last question. So you asked whether I analyze this in terms of oscillators. So I analyze it in terms of the research oscillator model idea. So the research oscillator model idea, you have basically 2 tendency equations that are coupled. And the tendency equations are of the temperature in this index box and the subsurface heat content. And when you look at the dynamical parameters like growth rate and coupling and noise forcing, you can clearly see changes in these experiments. And you can clearly see that these changes explain why you have much more variability and why the frequency is changing. Like the word key index that I showed you is based on the research oscillator model analysis. And then I can ask the question, where does these changes come from? And it's mostly, so the increased variability usually indicates that growth rates have changed, so becoming more unstable, and you can clearly see that. the system becomes more unstable when you couple it to another twin basin. But then also coupling parameters changes and noises changes, so it's a bit more complex. And I didn't quite understand your last questions. Maybe can you explain it again? Or
yeah, I'm just thinking, because there's a body of theory on simple harmonic oscillators, nonlinear simple harmonic oscillators that are coupled, and the conditions under which they will resonate or not, or that they'll phase lock, I should say. So they'll entrain one another. So you might have two pendulums that have slightly different frequencies, but if they're nonlinear and coupled, they can sort of agree on a common frequency, and then they'll both resonate strongly at that frequency. And I'm wondering if anything like that happens here, and maybe
especially in this situation here where I changed the basin widths, right? So you would argue if they all three are identical basins, they would all have the same frequency, and then they can probably better be synchronized. But then we increase one of the basin and decrease the other ones, they would have their different frequencies, and then they would be harder to synchronize. I guess you're going into this direction, right? And this is also something I think is happening here, but I haven't analyzed it in detail. But I think a key question that we are currently analyzing is that in order for ENSO to work, it is considered to be a coupling between sea surface temperature, surface winds in the atmosphere, and then the surface winds influence the ocean structure or the heat content or the thermochemical depths. And that feeds back to the SST. So a key element is you have to have the sonar winds responding. And the sonar winds, the idea is, would respond because you have a heat source from the ocean to the atmosphere, and that leads to vertical motion in the atmosphere. And that vertical motion in the atmosphere then leads to the inflow of the surface winds. Basically, you have, let's say, convergence at the surface that makes the air rise, and this convergence at the surface has the winds converging. In order to this to happen in the atmosphere, you need not only to have a heat source, but you also have to have the winds that come up. The air that goes up somewhere has to go down somewhere else. And I think in a simple theory like the Gill type response, you need to have a heat source that makes the air go up, but you have to have the air go down somewhere else as well. And I think this is where two dynamical oceans can go into play. If you have, let's say, in the twins, you have a heat source here in the left basin. At the same time, if you have a La Nina at the other basin, you have a heat sink at the other basin. And that can perfectly resonate your surface winds along the equator. You suddenly get a huge resonance of these surface winds along the equator, and they become much, much stronger. And we can actually show this, which I don't show here, but my PhD student Yi Wang is showing this in a simple atmosphere model that this actually works. So that you have the synchronization of heat sinks and sources that actually makes the surface equatorial winds be responding much more strongly. And I think this is the main effect that is going on here. It's the organization of the atmospheric heat sources and sinks that really leads to this huge amplification that we see.
Right. Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense.
If I could just maybe comment, if you go to the slide with the triples again, the trio and the trio 120. Yeah, so if you look at the top one, the trio is the one that's perfectly symmetric. The trio 120 is already slightly asymmetric, but you're getting, I think, still a lot of that three mode happening in the trio 120. Like it's, to answer, like it's sort of like it's close enough to being symmetric that it still has this rolling ENSO thing going on. And then I guess by the time you get to trio 160, it's sufficiently different that you're not getting that anymore.
Yeah, but what Andrew indicated is also if you go to the trio 160, you see less variability in the bigger basin. And okay, it might be that bigger basins just have less variability, as I showed you before, when you have the single basin. But at the same time, it might be that the other ones, the smaller basins, also have less variability. So maybe there is some kind of interference going on that actually they don't have the same frequencies and they don't like each other. But I haven't analyzed this because there's a number of things happening at the same time. And so I can't really say, is it just because the basin sizes have changed and they would just behave like this anyway? They would be having less variability? Or is it because of bad synchronizations that they are interfering with each other?
Right. And if the heat source and sink are larger, does that mean it's I don't know if you can think of the atmosphere as some sort of heat engine, but if you've got a bigger temperature difference, it'll just potentially increase the vigor of the whole thing, right?
Yeah, so this is what I think is happening here, so that the dynamical oceans can provide heat sources on a sustained several months, which the land cannot. And these heat sources from the ocean, dynamical oceans, can then kick off the atmosphere much more strongly. But we haven't really proven it yet. But I mean, this is a working hypothesis, and we see indications of that. But yeah, this is what I think is happening. This is also what I think will happen in the real world. But in the real world, I think there's a strong interaction between the Indian Pacific and the Atlantic that actually leads to the ENSO as we know it. And we cannot really study ENSO by just focusing on the heat source in the Indus region. That is just not enough. You need to think about when the air goes up somewhere, where does it go down? And how does it actually control how much air can actually go up? Because if the air wants to go up but can't go up, is suppressed by all the other regions, then it will not go up. Right? But the air going up is essential, otherwise you wouldn't get the equatorial winds.
Cool. Aiden, did you have your hand up still, or is it you're done? No, okay. Gabriel?
Hello, Dietmat. Thank you very much for your talk. I think that's very interesting simulations, and there are many things that you can get out of them. I've got two questions. The first one is, have you checked the strength of the ENSO feedbacks in those two models, and what's the difference between them? And the second one is that, given your hypothesis is related to the Walker circulation and to the atmospheric dynamics as well, do you think that the width of the land area that we are including in the model may have an effect on the results that you're seeing?
Yeah, good questions. And I've analyzed both of them. So first of all, I mentioned here the wind SST peaks, so the relationship between wind SST peaks at 150. So I haven't shown you the graph. So I analyzed the so-called Bjerknes feedbacks. So the main one is how SST influences winds, and then winds influence thermogram depths, and then thermogram SST. We have analyzed all three of them. And starting out with the wind SST relationship, we clearly see that this peaks in the Pacific size. So it's a Pacific size basin has the strongest relationship between zonal winds and SST. All other basin size have less of a relationship between it. It means for 1 degree warming in this box region, you get stronger winds in the Pacific size than in any other basin size. So the bigger the basin size gets, the winds are less organized and less strongly responding to the SST, which I think is one of the major causes why we're saying that the bigger basins don't have more variability, because actually the winds don't respond in the bigger basins. This we have analyzed in the GFDA models. I haven't done this analysis yet in the ACCESS model. This is why I have a question mark here, right? This is why I can't answer this, because I haven't done the analysis yet in the ACCESS model. But we also look at the other feedbacks, and there's a number of other feedbacks changing too. The cloud feedback actually becomes much more positive the bigger the basin gets. The ocean feedbacks, they become also more positive the bigger the basin gets, supporting more variability. Then I changed the land to be, so land right now in the tropics is all just 10 meters high, which is unlike the South America or Africa, which are much higher. So I increased the basin size as a topography to 2,000 meters, and that actually changes the variability substantially. Actually, I think, I don't quite remember what happens in the single basins, but I think the amount of variability in the single basins decreased, but it had a fairly serious impact on the mean state. So the mean state is actually quite sensitive to the amount of topography that you have. And then the coupling between the basins decreases if you increase the topography. So with higher topographies in the intersection between the basins, the coupling decreases, but doesn't go to zero. They are still highly synchronized, but instead of having, let's say, a 0.8 correlation between the basins, you get to a 0.6 correlation or 0.5. But you still have some. But clearly the topography matters, right? And this is actually one of the next experiments I did to analyze how topography will actually affect this. And I can only tell you for now that this has a strong impact, right? So high topography, like 2,000 meters, will change the behavior.
Yeah, and have you also checked the width of the basin, for example, the zonal extent of the land area?
Yeah, so not in a direct way. So let's say I haven't done two twins, and the two twins are not Pacific size, but two twins of Atlantic size. So I haven't checked that. But I only know that in the single basin, if you increase the land size, you're automatically reducing the ocean size. This had an impact, which I showed you. But I haven't done the ones with the twins or the trios where I increase the basin, the lands. Also, I haven't done that yet.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's looks like we're done with questions. But yeah, thank you, Dietmar, again.